Open this meeting of the Senate Economics References Committee for the inquiry into Australia's oil and gas reserves. The Senate referred this inquiry to the committee on the 19th of September 2019. The report date has been extended several times. On 11th May 2021, the Senate granted the committee a further extension to report by 2 December this year. Submissions closed on 1 November 2019, with the committee receiving 39 submissions. Due to COVID-19, the committee agreed to reopen submissions, receiving 14 additional submissions and 6 supplementary submissions. In total, 53 submissions were received. These documents are available on the committee's website. As this is a public hearing, a Hansard transcript of proceedings is being made. However, the committee may determine to agree to a request to have evidence heard in camera. Information on procedure rules governing public hearings and claims of public interest immunity have been provided to witnesses and is available from the Secretariat. Any witness called to answer a question for the first time should state their full name and the capacity in which they appear. Witnesses should speak clearly to assist Hansard to record proceedings. To assist the recording of this hearing, please ensure your microphone is set to mute when you are not speaking. I remind media representatives listening to follow the media guidelines and any instructions of the committee Secretariat. I ask everyone to ensure they have switched off or turned their mobile phones to silent. I would also like to advise witnesses that answers to questions on notice should be sent to the Secretariat by 5:30 p.m. Wednesday, 24th of November 2021. I now welcome representatives from INPEX. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
I'm Bill Townsend. I'm Vice President of Corporate at INPEX.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. Did you wish to make an opening statement?
I do have an opening statement to make. Yes, please.
Go for it, Mr. Townsend.
Thank you, Senator. INPEX welcomes the opportunity to participate in this inquiry. As you'd be aware, we provided a written submission to the committee in November 2019. Our key message then, as now, is that the provision of certainty in policy direction and stable regulatory and fiscal frameworks is where the government can have the most significant impact on attracting investment, and in turn in securing ongoing benefits of oil and gas reserves for the Australian public. INPEX is Japan's flagship exploration and production company, and we've been a member of the Australian business community for more than 35 years, and we're proud of our growing economic and social contribution to Australia. INPEX is active in several projects here in Australia. However, it is Ichthys LNG, which we operate, for which we are best known. Ichthys LNG involved an investment of more than 60 billion Australian dollars, and this has resulted in significant and ongoing economic and community benefits across the country and ranks amongst the very largest resource projects ever developed in Australia. The enormous projected economic benefits from Ichthys LNG were highlighted in a 2017 independent economic impact assessment prepared by the consultancy firm ACIL Allen. The same firm recently released a social and economic and I've got an example of that here. The same firm recently released a social and economic impact assessment from Ichthys LNG in the Northern Territory for the period 2020 to 2030, which has also been published. And these are both public documents, and I'd be very pleased to share them with you. We previously made a submission to this inquiry, and we welcome the opportunity to answer your questions. However, feel that the committee should really understand that the Australian people receive more benefit from projects like Ichthys LNG than just the taxes paid. And I would like to take this opportunity to outline some of the less obvious and perhaps less well-known benefits from the development of projects like Ichthys LNG. It may not come as a surprise to you that INPEX is a major employer in Australia, but were you aware that our largest office globally is in Perth? The accommodation village we constructed in Darwin to house our Ichthys LNG project construction workforce is now the National Centre for Resilience, the gold standard for COVID quarantine facilities. In the Kimberley, today we're the #1 user of Broomport and Airport, and there's a highly popular cafe in Broome that got its start providing coffee and breakfast to our workforce transferring offshore. Today, in the dry season, it employs 29 staff. Our helicopter operations have enabled the Judidjin remote Aboriginal community north of Broome to become self-sufficient through the establishment of helicopter refueling operations there. The $24 million Larrakia Ichthys Foundation Trust represents the largest benefits package outside of native title obligations. In addition to environmental benefits, our Savannah fire management programs in the Northern Territory provide economic opportunities to remote Aboriginal communities utilizing traditional land management practices. An environmental conservation project run in collaboration with the Bawanunga Ranger Group in Arnhem Land provides not just jobs, but hope to a disadvantaged community. The Acel Allen NT report identified that our Darwin workforce, which we call 500 families really, contributed in excess of 50,000 hours volunteering in the community last year. And that same report identified that for every Ichthys LNG job, 2.2 jobs were created across the community. This is evidence that a business ecosystem has emerged in Darwin to support our operations there. And to receive approval for a project like Ichthys LNG required us to undertake a great number of environmental studies in remote locations about which relatively little was understood. Today, we've published those studies in 2 books, one being here, the ecological studies of the Bonaparte Archipelago and Browse Basin, and a second on Darwin Harbour nearshore environmental monitoring. Again, enhancing the academic understanding of our environment. And the list goes on. So in conclusion, none of these benefits, big or small, would have been achieved without the development of Ichthys LNG, and were enabled by the policy settings in place in Australia in the lead up to our final investment decision nearly 10 years ago, which takes me back to my key message for this committee, which is don't shift the goalposts. I'll now be happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Townsend. I'll start with Senator Patrick.
Thank you very much, Chair. And certainly thank you for appearing. We haven't had many oil and gas companies actually appear directly, so I do appreciate the fact that that you have appeared directly. That won't stop me asking hard questions, however. So now INPEX would prepare monthly production reports for ICHES, which are submitted to NOCTA. There is a view that this data ought to be made publicly available. Indeed, Acel Allen has also done a study on this, and that's now public through this committee's estimates questions. Do you see any issues with those production reports being made public? So they're currently confidential, but there is consideration by government to make them public. And do you see any safety issues? The Labor Party raised safety issues recently in a statement dealing with these production reports.
I mean, INPEX doesn't really have any objection to those reports being made public. I suppose the one area that of concern, I think more generally for the industry, might just be around consistency of reporting and ensuring that there is, sometimes like for like, or that there isn't, that it's not misunderstood. But certainly there's no objection from us for that, and really it's a matter for government to decide the classification level of
so
that.
Consistency is important to you. I note that the US have a reporting system in terms of reporting reserves that is actually governed by regulation. There's nothing here that's like that, is there?
I don't believe so, no. The US would have the SEC regime.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not aware of anything here in Australia.
Thank you. Now, your submission states that from 2012 to 2017, INPEX companies and branch entities contributed $706 million in tax payments. Can you sort of break that down for me? How much of that was corporate tax? How much was PRRT? And which of the entities actually paid that tax?
I can break that down. In fact, we have a tax transparency report, and as we publish every year. I'm happy to share these. The most recent of these is from 2019, so I might use those figures since I have them to hand.
That's 18-19?
This is 18-19, yes.
Okay.
In that year, we paid a total of $223 million in taxes, of which income tax comprised $8 million, fringe benefit 12, payroll tax 22, interest withholding 92, and stamp duty 89. And mind you, Senator, this was at a time during the exact time that we were developing Ichthys LNG, which, as I indicated earlier, cost in Australian dollar terms in excess of $60 billion to construct. And that was over a 6.5-year construction period. But it's a 20-year period from the time that the field was, or that we were awarded the exploration permit to explore for what became the Ichthys discovery. So it's a long haul game.
Sure. Now, look, the reason I asked that question is I've looked at the tax transparency data provided by the ATO, and it comes up with a different number, so a lesser number actually. In fact, over the last 5 tax transparency years, it shows that you paid $116 million in tax. That's for income tax, which is why I was trying to break that down. I also, in some sense, object to the idea that, for example, PAYG is, I think you said, when you said income tax, did you mean corporate income tax? Are you including employees' PAYG in any of your numbers?
I don't have that level of specificity, Senator. I can get that for you on notice. The point, in these, I'm surprised that you have a different number. Obviously, these are published numbers by us. We put them out there. We stand by these numbers, and I'd be happy to look into that and reconcile them with the numbers that you have.
So just so we're very clear, my numbers come from the Tax Office Tax Transparency and only relate to corporate income tax and PRRT. So you've mentioned other taxes. You said FBT and other taxes.
These are all taxes paid to all governments. Yes, this
Okay.
is printed and published in our
All right.
tax.
Maybe if you could provide the committee with that tax transparency report, I appreciate it's probably on your website, but if you could flick it through to the
I'd be
secretary.
happy to provide that, Senator. Of course. Yep.
Okay, and is it a fact that all of your entities pay tax? So I've got just a list of ones that have appeared in the tax transparency. So Impex Alpha, Impex Australia, Impex Holdings Australia, Impex Sahel, and Impex Timor Sea.
Yeah. So we have any number of Australian entities, and again, I can get that information for you. It might be useful to provide
Sure.
that offline separately.
Sure. Okay, so
Breakdown by company.
sure. What are the corporate structure arrangements that Impex has established in relation to Ichi's LNG operation? So is it the case that the joint venture pays its own tax, or is it considered a consolidated tax group?
Each entity pays its own tax, so Impex pays its own tax for that.
Okay, so each of the subsidiaries pay their own individual tax rather than as a group arrangement.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
How much PRRT has Impex paid in relation to the resources extracted from Ichis since commencement?
Senator, we paid no PRRT yet, but that's, as others would have testified, that's completely understandable given, as I indicated previously, we've spent 20 years and $60 billion developing the project. It's been in operation for 3 years. We're only now starting to, get a return on that initial investment. We're in that capital recovery period, if you will, or the payback period. And PRRT only comes into effect, of course, once a project is profitable. And to use an analogy of a cake, which is perhaps a little bit dangerous given previous prime ministers have gotten into trouble on that issue of cakes. But the analogy with a cake is that we've spent time obviously considering what type of cake we want to bake, going out and getting the various ingredients, mixing them together, putting them into the baking tin. And now we're just at the start really of the baking period, if you will, if you consider operations to be baking. The cake has just been put into the oven. And now we're opening the oven door, if you will, to look to see, look, where's the PRRT? Well, the cake's not baked yet. We have to wait for the cake to be baked before we can enjoy it to its fullest. And that's where the PRRT really comes in.
Sure. So, and I understand that these are long projects. I'll come back to Ichi's, but let's just then switch to Prelude, the floating LNG platform. Shell's basically indicated, and I say this because you are, as I understand it, a partner in the joint venture. but Shell has basically advised shareholders that it doesn't expect to pay any PRRT for the resources extracted by the floating platform. Do you share that view?
Well, we are a 17.5% shareholder in Prelude Floating LNG. That is correct. And Senator, as others would have stated in their appearances, the PRRT and anything to do with forward-looking taxes really depends on, it's a crystal ball exercise. These are long-term, multi-decade projects. So it really depends on what the long-term international oil price is to be able to determine PRRT. Certainly, you'd be aware, and Prelude has not been without its challenges. It is a very high-tech, sophisticated, and advanced piece of equipment. It's cutting edge, and so some of the commercial challenges are out there, but the PRRT over time will really depend on profitability and how much resource can be extracted.
But do you have any reason to believe that Shell's view on this is wrong?
I have no reason to believe that, Senator.
Okay, so the issue there, obviously, you can have the best technologies, the latest equipment operating, but in this instance, it would appear that, and noting the return to Australians in terms of payment for the resource is by way of PRRT. In effect, the Australian taxpayer gets nothing in terms of royalties from that particular project.
Senator, if I could, and I actually look at this in quite a different way than what you're suggesting. And the way I look at a lot of these projects is, Australia has oil and gas reserves, and they're sitting around Australia. Many of them are not developed. So what you seem to be suggesting is that, they should be paying more. In this instance, Prelude should be paying more for...
Maybe some is what I'm suggesting.
Well, Senator, if you listen to my opening remarks, there's so many different ways in which the country is benefiting from these huge projects, and indeed from the technology that's been developed through these high-tech projects. There is an element. PRRT is only a small part of a much bigger picture, and it relates back to the risk sharing between companies and governments and all of that. The PRRT regime that's in place in Australia was and is extremely effective, and it's been proven to be so by the large amount of investment in attracting international investment to enable projects like Ichthys LNG to be developed. Were it not for those types of fiscal and regulatory settings that are in place in Australia, companies like ours wouldn't be investing in developing these, what are actually quite difficult to develop and challenging fields. And the Australian community would be left with gas in the ground.
Yeah, respectfully, you're like any other business in that you invest for the purpose of making profit, and that's the way our system works. Yours differs in that you profit from a resource. Like a lot of companies that operate around Australia, they pay for their in-feed, they provide a service or a product, they invest, they pay tax, they and produce a product, perhaps export as well. You're different in that you actually take a resource, an in-feed, and in effect you're not paying for it. So I get the rest of what you're saying. One might hope you might appreciate, from my perspective, representing South Australians, representing Australians, that the oil and gas gets taken and we don't get a royalty for that.
Well, Senator, we don't have a royalty regime in Australia, which is why no royalty is paid. But I do object to the idea that the Australian community isn't benefiting. Of course, the Australian community is benefiting in all sorts of ways. And there has been a review, as you'd be well aware, the Callaghan review. Michael Callaghan reviewed the PRRT regime, found it to be overall sound. There were some tweaks that were made to it as a result of the review, but overall it concluded as the industry concludes, that it's a very effective way of attracting investment and sharing risk in a way that's equitable to all parties, including first and foremost the Australian taxpayer.
All right, let's come back to Itchy's. Do you believe that PRRT will be paid in relation to that project? And if so, how much is your estimate of what the Australian taxpayer will receive in terms of PRRT? Appreciating what you say about about oil and gas price variations.
Yeah, so Senator, to do with PRRT on Ichthys, of course, the first answer is yes. I do expect us to be paying PRRT, and I certainly hope we will be paying PRRT, which, as you would appreciate, PRRT means we're running a profitable business.
Sure.
And that's desirable for everyone. And we invested in Ichthys in one sense to for the business side of it, but also there is an underlying element of providing energy security in the region. But that's another discussion for another time. Getting back to PRRT, again, it's the same answer I had for the Prelude question, really. It's PRRT gets paid based on production and based on the international oil price at the time, principally. Now, the volatility in oil prices makes it very difficult to predict with any accuracy when and where and how much PRRT will be paid. But that said, and just as a small example, November 2020, so 1 year ago, the average Brent oil price in that month was just over $42 a barrel, Brent. Today, the oil price for Brent, that same Brent, nothing different, $85 it's trading today. So twice the amount. So there's big variability. We get pandemics like COVID that can't be foreseen. There's so many variabilities that go into oil pricing that it makes it absolutely impossible to predict with confidence. But what I can say is, with no degree of certainty, but with a lot of degree of optimism, is that we will be paying PRRT, and that could be happening most likely in the 2030s.
Okay, in the 2030s. Now, just in relation to that, I mean, when a company like yours, and I've worked in the commercial sector for a couple of decades, invests in a project like this, you would have mapped out all of the costs, all of the returns, and you would have had some indication when the project was presented to the Australian government of what that PRRT would be. Do you know what was presented to the Australian government in respect to PRRT estimates?
We wouldn't have presented any economic estimates to the Australian government.
So you're suggesting the Australian government, when they approve projects, don't look to see what the return for the Australian public might be? Is that your evidence?
Well, I'll leave it to you to. My evidence really is that, of course, projects like this, we run our own internal economics, but I don't think that would be shared.
Well, why not? I mean, this is our resource, and you're saying you're not going to share with us what you think you would end up paying in return for our resource. I'm not trying to say don't make a profit. I'm not trying to say you invested and you're not entitled to make a profit. But that I would have thought would be a key factor in Australian granting approvals. And look, this committee has expressed frustration both through this inquiry and through estimates that, in fact, no one in Australia seems to be focused on return to this country. So, not NOPSEMA focuses on safety, not the focuses on titles. The department focuses on, perhaps developing some of these projects and assisting. No one appears to be focusing on the benefit, the return to Australian to the Australian taxpayer, and that's why I think the provision of that number would only be fair, noting it is our resource that you are taking from the Arafura. Well, I'm not sure which sea it is, but the waters to our
It's in the
north.
Indian Ocean in this particular case, but that's
Yeah,
not the
yeah.
point.
Sorry, that's Prelude. Sorry, but
Clearly not the point that you're trying to make.
sure. So you're not prepared to share what PRRT estimate you have for this project for our resource?
Senator, I go back. I mean, there's any number of models that are created. So the way this works inside of a company like ours or any oil and gas company is we'll model various scenarios. We'll have upside cases, downside cases, and then mid cases, and we'll run different models and try to assure ourselves that we're making a good decision in moving forward with the investment and with developing what is a highly complex and technologically advanced project. And this is something that is obviously not for the faint of heart. It's a very, these are huge infrastructure developments over many years, and there's,
Can I ask?
The certainty that you are suggesting in your question just simply doesn't exist around.
No, I don't mind if you were to come back to the committee and maybe take this on notice, to come back to the committee with the range that you've estimated from that modelling in terms of the possible PRRT that gets paid from this project. Would you consider taking that on notice and coming back to the committee with that? And if I could also ask you on notice to perhaps go back and find out whether or not the PRRT amount estimate was ever communicated to the Australian government, because I'd hate to have it on the record that the Australian government didn't look for that when perhaps they did. So just a confirmation.
Yes, Senator, I obviously will be very pleased to do that. I don't know every single aspect of what has been presented or hasn't been presented, and of course it has been more than 10 years since that would have happened. So perhaps my memory is different, but I will be happy to confirm my understanding or correct my understanding as the case may be.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's a long-running project. Just a couple more questions. In the last annual report, it was stated that you were evaluating the feasibility of sequestering CO2 at the Itchy's LNG plant in Darwin. What's the status of this evaluation? And do you have any experience of this globally?
So you are correct, Senator. We are investigating carbon capture and storage for Ichthys and more broadly globally. For Ichthys specifically, when Ichthys was developed, it was developed with carbon capture and storage in mind. So our facilities have actually been designed to be supplemented by carbon capture and storage kit, if you will, equipment. We already, of course, capture the CO2 much in the same way as a submarine does with an amine process. But that carbon is already, or the CO2 is already captured as part of our LNG process, because when we produce the LNG, it's pure methane that's getting cooled. So we take out all of the other gases. So that's already happening. We spent years actually investigating the possible locations for a carbon capture and storage site, and we've identified a location about 220 kilometers offshore from Darwin that we think is a highly prospective area for carbon capture and storage. It's an aquifer in the Petrel Subbasin. So that's something that we're looking at. We're moving forward on some studies with that. The CSIRO is leading a Darwin CCS hub, CCUS hub, I believe it's called, study. And this is something that we are very actively looking at as a means of reducing CO2 emissions from our Ichthys project. To your second question, I guess it was around our experience with this. INPEX in Japan does have a carbon capture and storage location in the Niigata prefecture. And we've been operating that since 1987. I want to say it might have been 1989, but for more than 30 years now, that's been in operation. And carbon capture and storage is something that in different guises, I suppose, the industry has been using for many decades now. Sometimes it's used as what we call enhanced oil recovery, of reinjecting. But our industry is very, familiar with the idea of geology and how a CCS project should be working.
Okay. Now, just for my sort of final question, Chair, you've got substantial operations around the globe. I'm just wondering how many different regimes does the company operate in, and how many sort of use a PRRT, how many use a royalty-based system, or some sort of combination of both?
Well, we operate in 17 countries or so today, Senator. I believe is the number. They'll have various. Each country has its own different regime. I couldn't. I'll have to take that one on notice as well to give a specific breakdown. But I will go back to my key message here, which is PRRT has actually worked extremely well for Australia in attracting investment like Ichthys LNG. It's propelled the country to be the leading producer of liquefied natural gas, and that's serving not just us today, but these projects are generating opportunities for years to come. So for our kids and our grandkids too. Ichthys has a 40-year project life.
Look, I'm just going to push back a little bit on that. And thank you for taking that on notice. That's good. But just in relation to the PRRT, there are many people in Australia that actually think it's working poorly. Now, it might be that it works well in attracting investment because ultimately people don't pay for the resource that they extract from the ground. That may well be part of the problem. So we might have to disagree with each other on the whether or not we're benefiting from PRRT. But look, thank you very much for your evidence. I have no further questions, Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Patrick. And thanks, Mr. Townsend, for appearing today. Much appreciated for the early start from WA. I'd now ask that you disconnect from the video conference and feel free to continue to observe the hearing should you wish to do so through the live stream on the Parliament's website.
Thank you very much.
I now welcome representatives from the CO2 CRC. Dr. Raab, can you hear me okay? Couldn't hear you.
They're on mute.
Maybe you're on
Yes.
mute.
Yeah, good morning. And yes, we can hear you very well.
Great, thank you. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. Information on procedural rules governing public hearings has been provided to witnesses and is available from the Secretariat. Witnesses should speak clearly into the microphones to assist Hansard to record proceedings. I would also like to advise witnesses that answers to questions on notice should be sent to the Secretariat by 5:30 p.m. Wednesday, 24th of November 2021. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
So my name is Matthias Raab, and I'm the Chief Executive of CO2 CRC.
And my name is Mohammed Bagheri. I'm Senior Manager Subsurface with CO2 CRC.
Thank you, Dr. Raab and Dr. Bagheri. Did you wish to make an opening statement?
No, we are fine. Thank you.
Okay. I'll hand to Senator Patrick to start with questions.
Can I just get you to put on the record a little bit about the CRC, a little bit about the history and who contributes to this?
Of course. Thank you, Senator. So CO2 CRC is a not-for-profit research organization, and we were formerly a cooperative research center, and since 2015, we continue with the same constitution, the same mandate, but we are not funded by the by the CRC Association anymore. And as part of our membership, we do have industry memberships represented from the likes of Chevron, Shell, Inpex, ENI, Low Emission Technologies Australia, Santos is among our membership. We do have the Australian government represented through Geoscience Australia. We do have the state government of Victoria as a funder, BHP. We do have research members, which are some of the major G8 universities in Australia, regional universities in Australia, Stanford University, Cambridge University, the national laboratories from the US Department of Energy.
Okay, thank you. So how many people do you employ?
We employ 20 people, and we do the majority of our work is conducted by research organizations, of which we have between 40 and 180 researchers participating in our research program.
Okay, I just want to go to some information that I've gathered. I know that you didn't make a submission, but phase 1 of the CO2 carbon or capture and usage storage, or EOR project, indicated a potential recovery of 3 billion barrels across Australia's basins from the injection and storage of 1 to 3 gigatons of CO2. So they're quite incredible claims. In effect, it seems as though you're suggesting that we can get an additional 3 billion barrels, which I understand to be like 50% again of what we've recovered to date, could be recovered in this way. Am I correct in having read that?
Yes, that number is correct.
So which of the existing fields contribute to the $3 billion of crude? You might have to take that on notice.
Yes.
So I just, and as Matthew says, it is correct. And these are, again, we emphasize that this is the potential. So not necessarily this is a reserve or 2P reserves or 3P reserves. So this is a potential extra recovery through CO2 EOR across all of the basins. So together with Geoscience Australia, we completed the phase 1 of CO2 EOR project and screening Australian basins for CO2 EOR potential for both enhanced oil recovery and associated CO2 storage at the during CO2 EOR. So we ranked the basins. So in terms of the potential for the basins, Gippsland Basin comes first, followed by Carnarvon Basin in Northwest Shelf and Bonaparte. So those 3 big offshore basins, and onshore we have Cooper, Manga, and Surat basins. So they are the 5 key basins which collectively, as you mentioned, around we have the potential of around 3 billion barrels of oil to be produced. Yeah.
You said Surat Basin. Did you say Cooper? Did I hear you say Cooper Basin?
Yes. Onshore
Okay,
Cooper and Surat.
Is that the basis for selecting Cooper and Surat for phase 2?
No, the basis for the, so like I said, in terms of the potential, onshore basins have less potential than offshore basins, but the reason that Cooper and Surat were selected for the second phase was they were onshore and more economic and more cost effective, so they are more accessible. That's why they were picked as as the for the second phase. But it can be followed by offshore basins as well.
Okay, so why wasn't Barrow Island considered, since it's already got ample CO2 separated, dehydrated and compressed, available for injection in the Gorgon gas plant? Why wasn't that selected?
So so we considered that one as well. Again, one was cost. So in the Cooper is still more cost effective in the Barrow Island. But the other reason is that the available CO2 at the moment is being sequestered in the Gorgon project. So there was no plan to inject into the oil fields there. But that again can be part of this. So we selected Surat and Cooper as this phase just to to establish a benchmark on how can we do the economic analysis and also calculate the CO2 EOR. It doesn't necessarily mean that other basins have less potential or should be excluded. So this was only the first phase, and we did as much as funding availability.
Okay, so if I move to phase 2 and of your project, I think you've said that 230 million barrels are recoverable from the Cooper Basin using enhanced oil recovery. Again, that's pretty impressive. If I sort of calculated that at $100 a barrel, that's $23 billion of crude or refined product that we don't have to import.
That's right.
Have I got those numbers right?
That's right. Yeah. And obviously they are low carbon intensity oil as well, because you are at the same time storing CO2.
Okay. So why isn't industry, so Beach Petroleum, or sorry, Beach and Santos, not Beach Petroleum, but Beach and Santos, why aren't they pursuing this?
Yeah, so I can, I guess, I mean, partly, I'm to be honest, first of all, I'm ex-Santos, so I worked for Santos.
Yeah.
I've worked in some of those assets. So we have 3 phases of production, as you probably know. So we have primary production, secondary production towards, through water injection, and then CO2 EOR. So most of those oil assets in the Cooper and Eromanga basins, they have just finished the primary production. So the priority for the operators is always to do like simple, straightforward works before going to more complex things like water injection or CO2 injection. And that's so most of those oil production are reaching to that primary production time, life period now. And that's as Santos started perhaps a couple of years ago to have a look at those CO2 EOR option, and they have started some water flooding projects. But the one reason is the timing. So most of those assets were operating on the primary production, which was straightforward and more cost effectively, obviously. And now it's time to to go through the second period of their production. And that's when they have started to look at it. They haven't operated it. The other one is the cost barrier, obviously. So we had a period of low oil price, so which made those projects uneconomic. As normally the threshold of like $60 per barrel is a good threshold for CO2 EOR, and that's where those projects start to become economic. And in those companies' portfolio is always the economic is the prioritize the projects. So up until let's say 2015 to 2020, always primary production had better economics than CO2 EOR and other competing projects, and now it's starting for CO2 EOR. Plus,
so are you of the view that they'll proceed with it?
I think it's a function of incentives as well. If we have incentives for CO2 EOR, it's a very, I mean, I'm just looking at the history in North America, for example. So North America CO2 EOR's project started from CO2 sources which were available back in the 1970s. But then when the government started to provide incentives, then that's where they started to capture anthropogenic CO2 and do the CO2 EOR. And I guess it depends on the size of the company, depends how they operate. So maybe smaller companies move earlier on CO2 EOR because they are more lean and they can do projects more economically. Bigger companies might look at the incentives.
Yeah, and I may add, Senator, one more point of why CO2 CRC looks at enhanced oil recovery and the sequestration of carbon dioxide. And in the more nuanced way, we try to ascertain the actual maximum CO2 sequestration as part of the process. And while adding to the reserve base of Australia is very, very important, to understand whether we have a win-win situation with sequestration has driven the assessment that we did. And while traditionally CO2, EOR, carbon dioxide is a commodity that companies pay for, so they want to have maximum CO2 recovery for the further re-injection of CO2. And in the context of a more nuanced energy transition, the actual loss or the sequestration of the CO2 in the subsurface is to be enhanced. And in fact, on that possibility, the enhanced oil recovery through CO2 could actually be net negative in terms of its emission profile. And that means that while we actually have an economic recovery of our oil reserves, we do also have, even including the combustion of the newly produced hydrocarbons, we will still have more CO2 sequestered than actually combusted or polluting the atmosphere through the recovery. And that's the concept that we are driving forward, and that what we see is the paradigm shift in a more nuanced energy transition as we may phase out hydrocarbons over decades to come.
Sure. Now, just my understanding, Santos is embarking on CCS using CO2 that it separates from the natural gas at Moomba, and it's going to get Australian carbon credit units for that. If you use that for enhanced oil recovery, wouldn't it generate a life cycle cost or a profit per tonne? I mean, surely where I'm going is that, or maybe I'll step back.
Yeah.
I'm concerned that the Australian government hasn't, in some sense, mandated to companies where there's a technology available the requirement to maximise the extraction from tenements around Australia. Kind of not just taking the easy resource. Rather, the Australian government placing requirements on companies saying, look, you can take the easy stuff, but you have to maximise the resource that is taken from the tenement over the life, and you have to do some of these methods that you have been researching. Do you have a view on that? Is the Australian government being active in this space? I suspect not.
I would say my initial view, but it may be patchy, let's say, in details on Santos's plans and submissions, but more broadly, the incentivizing carbon capture and storage projects through Australian carbon credit units is a pretty significant step forward to decarbonize the fossil fuel sector in particular. It's the lowest cost at the moment to decarbonize through CCS. And in that step alone, the government has clearly sent a globally very significant incentive that is also mirrored on the incentivization in the United States. In terms of your question, Senator, with respect to, I understand your question that whether enhanced oil recovery through CO2 should have been mandated without tax incentives. Is that what you were referring?
Well, it's a case of if we just look at the resource that's available, and this is an Australian resource that is an Australian community's resource, and in effect, you let a company come in and just take the easy stuff, and then walk away from the tenement. The resource is still there, but no one will extract it, even though perhaps if the government were to take a proactive role and say, as part of the conditions of granting a tenement, granting a production or exploration and then production license, placing a requirement on companies to maximise the return from the tenement, the resource extracted, that we would get a much better outcome. And I suspect it's not happening.
I think, Senator, I guess it's a function of the economics as well. So as part of that phase 2 study that you mentioned, which is in progress, we are doing the economic analysis now, and we will find out with some robust assumptions that we are consulting with those main operators, including Santos, Beach, and Bridgeport. How much from that 230 barrels is economic? So how much is negative economic and how much is positive economics? I think, like I said, I guess it's there is a competition in the portfolio, and they do obviously the most economic projects. And I can understand that mandating those EOR technologies, but I don't think that there has been precedent elsewhere in the world. So there is no even in the US or South America or in Canada, it wasn't mandatory. So, but there were incentives on the other hand to store CO2 while doing CO2 and one of the examples is 45Q, right? So they are paying $35 per ton of CO2 they are storing at the same time of CO2 So I guess that's where it makes it like a win-win situation. So reducing the CO2 footprint and also maximizing the oil and gas assets.
Yeah.
So I guess that has been the model.
Okay, so has your organisation approached the South Australian government or the Queensland government regarding oil reserve potential in the Cooper Basin using EOR?
Not yet, Senator, not yet, because the study is not completed, but that's our plan for next year. And I'd like to add to your previous question in terms of the remaining resources and the expectation for production. We see at the moment a much larger opportunity for Australia in the context of using the fields in the Cooper Basin, for instance, as a potential for large-scale sequestration, which goes far beyond the life of enhanced oil recovery. So they could be looking at a 30-plus year plan, which would give rise to capturing emissions, let's say, from various sources in Queensland and transporting, pipelining them, the carbon dioxide into the Cooper Basin, could potentially be could provide a significant opportunity for Australia to decarbonize some of the emitting power generation fleets in Queensland, while the benefits in terms of the CO2 storage and combined enhanced oil recovery could actually provide economic wins in both sectors, decarbonisation as well as adding to the reserve base.
Is there any merit in removing some of the Australian carbon credit units in circumstances where EOR is possible but not being exploited? So you kind of say, look, you can't take a benefit from this from a funding perspective if you're still not maximising the resource.
Again, it's an economic, I would say it's an economic question, and then essentially saying, well, look, where's the cutoff for a company to walk away from the assets? If it's not economic, they may say, well, look, then we depart from this asset. But where there is precedence to precisely your question, Senator, is the United States actually has divided the ability to get tax incentives with a 45Q tax, where $50 per ton can be claimed for fuel sequestration, and $35 can be claimed from the government as its incentives for enhanced oil recovery, while the current price for CO2 is about $15 per ton. So that for operators, the actual incentives are pretty much the same. And that had now really triggered a sequestration industry to become far more serious, because the investment, the longevity is more significant in the decarbonisation portfolio than it may be for others. And that had certainly helped the industry to make significant steps forward.
Okay, so the government provides incentive here and industry in the US are following. What's your prediction on what's going to happen?
Look, I would say first and foremost, enhanced oil recovery had not really been done at any economic scale in Australia, and that is certainly a consideration that the country should have, and it should look at its synergies that it has in decarbonising other sectors at the same time. They're actually synergies that help us to reach our decarbonisation targets faster. With having a more nuanced energy transition, and enhanced oil recovery actually sits right in the centre. And there are several opportunities where this can be done in Australia. The recommendation on the current information that we have available, it is initial incentivisation is necessary. What it looks like in a longer term transition really depends on other economic factors that should be considered. So it's not a black and white answer, but I think there are some win-win situations and options here for us.
Okay, so I'm sort of mindful of we're just about to run out of time, but is there anyone in the Australian government that is aware of this and is looking and acting on this? I mean, are you guys talking to the Australian government or to state governments? So you sort of said for South Australia, Queensland, not at the moment. Are you waiting for your own studies to conclude phase 2, or can you not simply take the experience in the US and share that with the Australian government?
So we have shared I have shared initial results. I've briefed the Queensland state government on the Department of Resources, the Department of Environment and Science, and other Director Generals on the potential that exists. For some, it was new. For others, certainly some of the infrastructure requirements, opportunities were known. We have stimulated this study out of our own ambition. We had initially very little support, both from industry and government, because enhanced oil recovery in Australia was considered as not necessary due to the specifics of the hydrocarbons, the light oils. And as the discussion became more and more relevant in the context for us to utilize sequestration and have more economic hubs and concepts, that kind of initiated us to look from a different paradigm or different angle at enhanced oil recovery. And we believe that we do want to go out early next year, probably in the first quarter, to make the full impact for both energy security as well as decarbonisation options known to both state and federal governments across Australia, because the opportunity is not just in the Cooper and Surat basins. As you mentioned before, they're also in Western Australia, in Victoria, and other basins. And it is a considerable concept that we are proposing. Okay,
just as a final perhaps request, you didn't make a submission to this inquiry, which is focusing on maximising the benefit of our oil and gas resources. It seems to me as though the work that you're doing has real potential to do exactly what this committee is investigating. And I wonder if you'd perhaps spend a little bit of time, it wouldn't have to be substantive, but putting something down on paper that went to the what's happening in the US and perhaps some preliminary findings or expectations out of your phase 2 program, because that's a way of getting this information into Parliament House, and all committee inquiry reports do go to government, and I think that would be most helpful if you'd be obliging.
We would be very pleased to do that, Senator. Was that by the 24th of November?
I'd have to rely on the chair for that, and I might just go back to the chair, but thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. That would be a pleasure. Sure.
Thanks, Senator Patrick, and thanks, Dr. Raab and Dr. Bagari for being with us. And just to confirm that answers to questions on notice is by the 24th of November, 5:30 p.m. Thank you for appearing as witnesses today. We appreciate your time. And that now concludes today's public hearing. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank all those who have made submissions and for the witnesses for making themselves available and their ongoing cooperation with this inquiry. The committee stands adjourned.